Welcome, everyone. My name is Marlene Leones Gonzalez, and I'm the Communication and Outreach Coordinator here at the Latin American and Iberian Institute at the University of New Mexico. The LAII, as we call it, promotes and supports interdisciplinary teaching, research, and meaningful public engagement to advance the production and dissemination of knowledge about Latin America and Iberia. Latin America is designated as one of 7 priority areas of research for UNM, and we proudly contribute to both the university's intellectual community as well as global discourse through our public programming. We'd like to take a moment to recognize the traditional homelands of the Pueblo of Sandia on which UNM sits. The original peoples of New Mexico, Pueblo, Apache, and Navajo have deep connections to the land and have made significant contributions to the broader community statewide. We honor the land itself and those who remain stewards of this land throughout the generations, and also acknowledge our committed relationships to Indigenous peoples. I'd like to now introduce our speaker today, Dr. Benjamin Junge, the professor of anthropology at the State University of New York at New Paltz. His research focuses on class mobility, political attitudes, gender, sexuality, health, and religion, with regional focus on Brazil and other settings in Latin America. His recent publications include Precarious Democracy, Ethnographies of Hope, Despair, and Resistance in Brazil, and Cynical Citizenship, Gender, Regionalism, and Public Subjectivity in Porto Alegre, Brazil, 2018. He recently co-directed a 3-year investigation funded by the National Science Foundation of political subjectivities among the demographic sector once known as Brazil's new middle class, focusing on perceptions of the 2013 through 2018 crisis, cultural memory of the authoritarian past, and the rise of popular conservatism. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Junge.
Hi, everyone. I'm going to share my screen. Hopefully technology will work. Let's see, here we go. One moment. How's that look? It's okay? You can hear me all right? Okay, great. All right, everyone. So good afternoon. Boa tarde a todas, todos e todes. It's great to be here, if only virtually. Thanks especially to Marlene Leones Gonzalez for the invitation. It's nice to connect, if only virtually, with UNM and the Latin American and Iberian Institute. I have never been and hope to actually get to the campus sometime. I am very impressed that at least what I could find out on the website from that the chairs of 3 departments, history, geography, and music, are all Brazil specialists. So that sounds pretty awesome. The core of my presentation today is an ethnographic analysis of intergenerational tensions as they shape political sensibilities among a family I call the Pereiras. The narratives of this family are the basis for a book that I'm currently writing. I'm based in Santa Fe at the School of Advanced Research. It's a work in progress, and I'd be grateful for your critical feedback afterwards. Let's see, I think yeah, here we go. The material for the book and for my talk today is an offshoot of from a much larger project. From 2016 to 2018, I was one of 3 principal investigators on a study funded by the National Science Foundation to understand how experiences of socioeconomic mobility and precarity among poor and working class Brazilians during recent years has influenced political views, class identifications, and collective memory. Combining survey methods with a range of ethnographic interviewing and observational techniques, we conducted fieldwork in the 3 cities of Recife in the northeast and Rio de Janeiro and São Paulo in the southeast, with my excellent colleagues Sean Mitchell from Rutgers University Newark and Charles Klein from Portland State University, directing fieldwork in the latter 2 cities, Rio and São Paulo, respectively. I'm happy to talk more about the broader project and the methodology during question and answer if anyone wants. this is a shameless plug. Marlene's already mentioned it. Some of the material I'm presenting today can be found in my chapter in this book, which I organized and am one of 4 editors on. It's called Precarious Democracy. It came out recently, and it is made up of 15 evocative chapters, ethnographic accounts of how Brazilians from diverse walks of life have experienced and responded to economic precarity, political crisis, and diminishing hopes for the future from 2013 to 2019. You can see how to get the book. If you're interested, the paperback version with the discount will cost you about $27. So it's a reasonably affordable book. All right, enough of the shameless plug and onwards. So I'd like to begin with a short vignette from July 2017. And I'm going to read from my field notes. I'm getting ready for bed and suddenly receive a ping on Facebook Instant Messenger. It's from Dona Helena. I have a quick look and find that Helena has sent me a link with no accompanying explanation to a YouTube clip called Democratic Military Regime. With the anthem of the Brazilian Marines playing in the background, the 6-minute clip recounts the accomplishments of the generals among whom the presidency rotated during Brazil's 1964 to 85 military regime. The military presidents, quote, were accused of many things, unquote, the clip proclaims, but were never recognized for their achievements, unquote. First and foremost, preventing the spread of communism. With heavy use of green and yellow for text and background colors, the clip proceeds to highlight other major accomplishments, including infrastructure and resource development projects, macroeconomic restructuring and growth, contributing to expansion of the export sector, and the creation of major government agencies such as the National Bank and the Federal Police, as well as centralized government provision of electricity and telephone service. Halfway through, the clip attributes Brazil's, quote, shameless present-day position to, quote, people who previously fought for communism. Under the military regime, the clip continues, Brazil was, quote, globally recognized as a military and economic power, unquote. There are also some summary statements about how, in many respects, life was better then, naquela época, than it is today. For example, with respect to crime and security. The generals made people respect laws, the clip asserts. So there was, quote, infinitely less, unquote, crime and greater security for the Brazilian people. There was no need for prisons since the liberators of the people, the libertadores do povo, made sure laws were followed. The clip ends with the motto, quote, Brazil, love it or leave it, unquote, again invoking the menace of communism with the proclamation, quote, Brazil isn't red, it's green and yellow, I love you. It isn't until the next day, when I'm in the kitchen helping Dona Helena wash the dishes, that I learn it was her second oldest son, Edmilson, who lives with his wife and 2 sons just upstairs, who sent her the clip. Quote, he didn't have patience to serve in the army, she tells me. He was promoted to corporal, but he didn't want to return because he didn't like how the superiors order around the subordinates, you know? But we know, well, I know that he's in love with the army, unquote. Anytime something about the army appears on Facebook, Helena tells me, Edmilson reposts it. I express my surprise and Helena giggles as she tells me that I should probably ask him about the clip. Then she sighs and toweling off the dishes reflects, quote, back in those days there was respect. Naquela época se tinha o respeito. Unquote. Today, it's that shamelessness, that thing. Children don't respect father and mother, and neither do people respect neighbors or teachers, unquote. Elena sent me the military democratic regime clip during my first month living in her extended family's residential compound, which I was still settling in, and had yet to imagine that the Pereiras, Elena's family, might take center stage in a book project. By this time, mid-2017, Jair Bolsonaro was rapidly rising to national prominence, and along the way regularly expressed nostalgia for the dictatorship years. A year earlier, for example, he had publicly praised the ethos he associated with this historical period, stating, quote, "There was decency and respect for the family. Things today are disgraceful," unquote. The rhetorical elements and narrative structure of Bolsonaro's nostalgia bore a family resemblance to those of the YouTube clip, and perhaps more strikingly, to how Elena herself had spoken to me about life in those years, naquela época, even though at the time she had little love for the far-right politician. Like much of his rhetoric, Bolsonaro's nostalgia for the ditadura, for the dictatorship, has a self-aware and intentionally provocative quality to it. By the same time, his statements about the military period should not be dismissed as the clownish rants of a fringe politician trying to get attention. We can't forget that at Dilma Rousseff's 2016 impeachment trial, then Congressman Bolsonaro declared his support for the PT president's ouster as a tribute to Carlos Alberto Brilhante Ustra, the army colonel who directed one of the military regime's most well-known torture facilities and was personally responsible for Rousseff's torture sessions following her 1970 arrest. In comparison with other South American nations, which experienced dictatorial regimes in the mid to late 20th century, the post-authoritarian Brazilian state stands out for its sluggishness in encouraging cultural conversation and shared cultural memory around the military years. Government-led initiatives to encourage a reckoning with the military period have been intermittent and circuitous in comparison to Argentina and Chile, described by historian Rebecca Atencio as a, quote, reconciliation by institutional forgetting, unquote. The series of conversations to which Elena's clip opened up, it opened up fascinating and troubling questions pertinent to the maelstrom of cynicism and disenchantment, which seemed to be reaching fever pitch in the 2018 elections as they loomed. Questions like, in what ways do expressions of nostalgia both reinforce and subvert a shared understanding, especially along generational lines and via online social media, of what family means? To what anxieties and frustrations about Brazil's current crisis moment, and to what hopes for a better future are expressions of nostalgia tied? More broadly, is there a way to view nostalgia for the militares as something other than a reactive social amnesia which leads Brazil away from democracy and towards populism and authoritarianism? To address these questions, my talk today moves through a series of ethnographic moments from fieldwork in 2017 and 2018. Let me get all of the material up here on the screen. This is the next couple of slides, a quick summary of this current moment that Brazil is in. Around 2010, Brazil seemed to be a country on the rise, with the 2014 World Cup and 2016 Summer Olympics secured. Brazil's international reputation as an emergent world power with firm democratic and economic foundations seemed assured. After decades of economic instability, the years following the 2002 election of President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva of the Leftist Workers' Party, or PT, were characterized by economic growth and the massive reduction of poverty and inequality. During Lula's 2 terms in office and the first term of his PT successor, Dilma Rousseff, an estimated 30 million people rose above the poverty line. The emergence of this demographic sector, the so-called new middle class or nova classe media, was celebrated as evidence of Brazil's entrance onto the world stage as a modern nation. While there is some debate about who gets the credit for this extraordinary demographic transformation, most agree that both macroeconomic factors, for example, rising Chinese demand for Brazilian exports, and government initiatives in the form of social welfare programs, or what they call in Brazil social assistance programs, increasing minimum wage and greater access to higher education were all crucial. There is little doubt, however, that without the social welfare programs implemented under 14 years of Workers' Party rule, programs like Bolsa Familia, the world's largest conditional cash transfer program, the scale of poverty and inequality reduction would have been massively diminished. In this sense, Brazil's so-called new middle class owes much of its mobility to the PT. The optimistic moment ended abruptly in 2013 when demonstrators protested increased bus fares, bloated expenditures on the World Cup and Olympic Games, and diminishing social support from the government. In 2014, greater numbers of protesters mobilized against corruption and called for President Rousseff's ouster. Incited by the conservative national media conglomerate Globo, the protests were marked by expressions of rage against Lula, against Dilma, and against their party, the PT. By the time Dilma Rousseff was impeached in 2016, Brazil was facing the worst recession in 25 years. Meanwhile, unemployment and inflation were on the rise, and all of the former excitement about Brazil's new middle class had more or less evaporated as many members of this demographic group fell back below the poverty line. In 2018, as I'm guessing many of you know, Lula began a 12-year prison sentence after having been found guilty for corruption. And of course, 2018 was the year in which hard-right candidate Jair Bolsonaro beat out his PT challenger for the presidency. A bunch of stuff has happened since 2018, but I won't get into that today. The reversal of fortune that I just described and the structures of affect to which the reversal of fortune gave rise is the national context for my research and for my book project. The book I'm writing explores how the period leading up to the divisive 2018 elections was experienced by once rising poor families in the Recife neighborhood where I resided during fieldwork, a neighborhood I refer to, and it's a pseudonym, as Morro Doce, which means literally sweet hillside. Morro Doce is a Recife neighborhood. It's home to about 30,000 residents and is situated about 45 minutes by bus from Recife's downtown centro. Unlike many neighborhoods in Recife, which it's largely a flat city, Morro Doce is a hilly neighborhood. You can see an image of that in the upper right-hand corner. You can see an image of the main thoroughfare that runs through the neighborhood in the lower right-hand corner. In the lower left-hand corner. In the lower right-hand corner, you can see one of my excellent research teams who helped me out with ethnographic interviewing in this neighborhood, and we are being photobombed by the hairdresser from around the corner from where I was living. I first met the Pereiras in 2017 when I was introduced to Dona Helena, the matriarch, through a mutual friend from her neighborhood who had worked for me on a big survey I mentioned earlier. I rented a room from Helena for a few months that year in 2017. And in 2018, sorry about that. And in 2018, when I returned to Recife for 7 months to teach at the local university and complete project fieldwork, I regularly visited the Pereiras to catch up on the family's comings and goings. Like many working-class Brazilian families, the Pereira family has thrived in recent years. After years below the poverty line, by 2018, the family's per capita household income rose to the category economists typically refer to as lower middle class. And the grandchildren had gotten into college through a federal affirmative action program targeting poor and non-white applicants. As I came to know the Pereiras, forging lasting friendships with the family's matriarch, Elena, and the families of her 4 adult children, I gained access to a rich set of narratives that speak to the hopes and frustrations of millions of once rising poor Brazilian families in times of growth and crisis. My account of the Pereira family and similar families from the neighborhood draws from my own field notes, from informal and structured interviews, and from observations both face-to-face and online. Over the past 2 decades, the Pereira's house, it's the one on the right that has 2 women out front, was once, it was once a precarious hillside dwelling, but it has since been fortified into a safe and stable residence in which Elena and the families of her children occupy separate households connected by maze-like hallways. The house sits on the neighborhood's main thoroughfare. The family's economic stability comes in large part due to gainful employment for most of Elena's children. Her oldest son, a fellow named Gabriel, is a sergeant in the Brazilian army, giving him a robust salary that provides financial security for the family and has enabled the purchase of a humble country house a couple of hours from Recife. I'm going to share a couple of moments with you, each one the center of a chapter in my book. One covers the detective work I did to uncover the meanings of the military regime clip for the rest of Elena's family. And the next moment, which is really 2 adjacent and related moments, was a year later, less than a month before the October 2018 elections, and it delves into how social media can complicate conventional modes of familial interaction. All right, so some field notes from August 5th, 2017. I am at the family's country house, or their sítio, a couple of hours outside of Recife. Most of the family is sitting at a big table. Edmilson, who is Elena's 2nd oldest son, the one who had sent her the clip, is cooking meat on the barbecue, and the cachaça is starting to flow, which is to say we're starting to get tipsy. This is my chance to ask about the clip he had sent to his mother, and he responds as follows. He says, there was a period here in Brazil that had the military regime. Brazil was governed by the military. This was the best time for Brazil when many things developed. Brazil grew, the workers had rights, roads were built, hospitals were built, but politicians don't want this. Politicians want to steal. Then he makes a provocation. He says, nowadays it's a big mess. If you follow what is happening with the president of Brazil today, it's a shame. And the military cannot take power again, because if they do, it will be considered a coup. If you ask 99% of Brazilians, they would want the military to take over Brazil again. That's why I sent that video there, to show that at that time, at the time of the military, that's when things were good, unquote. In the ensuing conversation, there's more talk of respect and the familiar themes of violence and security. I have a couple of comments on top of my blank screen here. As I'm listening to Edmilson, the language he uses to describe the military regime's positive contributions is eerily reminiscent of the clip he'd sent to his mother a couple of weeks prior. Indeed, with all the initial talk of public works, economic development, and workers' rights, it feels to me like, intentionally or not, he's regurgitating the clip's content and discursive styles. As the conversation moves along, however, I increasingly have the sense that Edmilson is being playful, intentionally provocative, and not fully serious, in a manner consonant with the Brazilian figure of the brincalhão, or clown. He's happy, for example, both to launch and retract hyperbolic claims, such as his assertion about most Brazilians wanting the military generals to take power, which meets with immediate resistance from everyone else at the table, and which he easily takes back with a chuckle and a shrug. Still, there's both a certain consistency and familiarity to Edmilson's account of what life was like under the military regime. As he describes it, it was a time when public spaces were safe, when everyone shared the same vision of patriotism, when youth respected adults and were less selfish, when rules were followed because the consequences for bad behavior were real. In the moment, I conclude that Edmilson does not actually want the military to take over. Rather, he is so fed up with corruption that he just craves a complete bulldozing of the entire political structure. It's a strong but non-specific desire, and the image of military generals in control satisfies that craving, at least in the context of an informal conversation with friends and family and involving alcohol. The conversation lasts nearly 3 hours and involves several other family members and friends. Among these is Edmilson's older brother, Gabriel, the military sergeant whose salary allowed for the purchase of the country house and ensures a reasonably comfortable life for his mother, Helena. Gabriel, the only one of Helena's children who doesn't have children of his own, articulates the strongest critique of the status quo and focuses on moral crisis as the principal source of the problem. Quote, Brazil has become very soft, frouxo, and corrupt, he tells me. And this has led not only to a moral unraveling, but also to a weakening of ambition and goals among the younger generation. Gabriel recognizes that opportunities for education and work are limited for poor and working class Brazilians. But rather than structural reforms, such as affirmative action, to recalibrate access to these forms of mobility, his concern is with the softness of today's youth, which leads him to the conviction that a more structured, hierarchical form of education is the key to cultivating the respect and discipline that Brazil so desperately needs. Edmilson's wife, Luzimar, is also at the table, and she too laments the disillusion of Brazilian morality, making heavy use of the notion of strictness or rigor, a solidity of moral values that no longer exists. The examples she gives almost always concern the behavior of today's teenagers, as when she explains, quote, these days the kids go out looking like however they want, unquote. To this, her husband, Edmilson, playfully responds, quote, just look at Andrea's hair, unquote. Andrea, who is not participating in this conversation, is Edmilson's 17-year-old niece. She recently cut her hair super short, and other than her cousin Everton and me, no one much likes the look. That's who Edmilson is talking about. In statements by Helena, Dona Helena, Gabriel, her oldest son, the sergeant, military sergeant, Edmilson and his wife Luzimar, there is manifest frustration over the disillusion of parental authority, in part due to the disintegration of morality and respect among the younger generation, and over parents' inability to control their children outside of home space. With expressions of frustration, there is a strong tendency towards reductive binary logics. For example, permeating both Edmilson and his older brother Gabriel's talk is an implicit contrast between politicians who are opportunists and thieves, and the military, represented as the guarantor of rights, services, and security. There are also binary logics contrasting the present with back then, naquela época, as when Helena, Gabriel, Edmilson, and Luzimar imagine life to have been better with respect to the moral rigor they find so lacking today. There are different constructions of corruption, corrupção, invoked in these narratives, ranging from Helena's and Edmilson's emphases on the shameless behavior of politicians to Gabriel's more expansive construct encompassing moral disintegration as well. In a chat I had with Elena a few days before the country house trip, she linked moral corruption to a more general defect in Brazilian national character, telling me, quote, the Brazilian is a scoundrel in every way. O brasileiro é safado de todo jeito, unquote. These constructions of corruption follow patterns previously observed by Isabella Calil and colleagues, among others, that beyond the comportment of politicians, the notion of corrupção comes to encompass a pervasive disordering of values and customs, supposedly jeopardizing family order. The complaints of Luzimar and Edmilson about today's youth also suggest a particular anxiety about the breakdown of gender norms, insofar as they each of these two people express discontent in the case of their niece with the close cropped hair, discontent with unfeminine women. There is a strong resonance between Gabriel, the oldest son, Elena's oldest son, between Gabriel's vision of his role within the family as the guarantor of order and stability, and his desire for a national leader he believes will restore order and stability to Brazilian society. My reading of Gabriel's understanding of his unique role in the family, of course, has gendered dimensions and may reflect a longing for a masculinity grounded in a man's ability to provide for his family, a masculinity undermined with the expansion of public discourse around the rights of LGBTQ Brazilians, emblematic of the PT years. In this sense, the turn toward Bolsonaro can be seen as a move to restore a patriarchal gender order that fell into disarray with the multicultural embrace of the PT years. Now let's fast forward a year to September 2018, just a month before the big elections. In the early hours of a Monday morning, Dona Helena shares a YouTube video on her Facebook page, in which Bolsonaro gives a speech promising that as president, he will preserve family values and devotion to God and homeland, and that he will protect Brazil from gender ideology and communism. There's no accompanying commentary from Helena, but her post quickly elicits a handful of likes, including from her oldest son, Gabriel. And within an hour, a comment from a distant friend who, to this day, I've never met, a guy named Hamilton. He says, his comment is, quote, "How great that you changed your vote, Helena," he writes, "Congratulations." Helena quickly responds, quote, "I didn't change, nor did I even decide if I will vote. Politicians all make promises and do nothing. The government with its gang of thieves is sinking our country. When Bolsonaro makes his explanations in this video clip that I posted, really what I think is that no one will change anything, unfortunately. I don't believe it, and I don't like to see my family discussing politics or religion," unquote. Before long, Helena posts a more thoughtful response. She writes on Facebook, quote, "On certain points, I agree with Jair, except that he's being very radical on other points. I don't accept fighting violence with violence. Despite what people are saying about Lula, he was the only president who really cared about the people. And there will be no other who will do the same, unfortunately. I respect the choices of other people, but I don't believe in politics. I only had one president and he is gone, but still lives in my heart as a person who solved the problem of hunger for many. Lula, always Lula." It's kind of chilling and peculiar to think about that he is not gone, and actually, but that's another conversation. Of course, Lula is the front runner for the elections coming up this October. That evening, Helena's grandson, Everton, chimes in with a single word in this unfolding Facebook conversation. The word is misericordia, a Northeastern colloquialism that can loosely be translated as good Lord. or to put the right intonation, good Lord. Hamilton, who Everton doesn't know personally, responds to this with a variation on a widely circulated Bolsonaro campaign slogan, which many of us, I'm sure, are familiar with, "É bom já ir se acostumando," which is a play on words, of course, in Portuguese, but here means literally, you'd better start getting used to Jair. For the next hour or so, Everton and Hamilton respond to each other's posts with growing antagonism. Everton chides Hamilton for thinking a candidate with so few accomplishments in his 28-year political career could do anything as president. Hamilton is initially playful in his rebukes to Everton, asserting that governing the country requires different qualifications than being a congressman, but eventually calls Elena's grandson, quote, uninformed and unpoliticized, unquote, and tells him to stop posting nonsense, bobagens. At this, Everton responds to Hamilton, typical of Bolsonaro voters, they can't manage to dialogue without offending others. If you vote for someone who thinks that arming the population will work in Brazil, who has no clue on women's rights, is extremely racist and homophobic, among other absurdities, well, for sure I am unpoliticized. I'm not going to stay here on the internet dialoguing with you because my thinking isn't going to change and neither is yours. Next time, don't respond to commentaries that have nothing to do with you. Hamilton quickly responds, quote, and cursing Bolsonaro with those adjectives isn't offensive? Come on, you think you've got it all figured out, kid, unquote. Elena's follow-up is directed at her grandson. She writes on the public Facebook commentary, quote, dear, don't discuss it with this person. You are beginning now. You'll have a lot of time to understand how everything works. My grandson, kisses, beijos, unquote. Everton acquiesces to his grandmother's request, commenting, quote, okay, I'm going to call it quits here. Patience for adults who should have a drop of conscience. Good night. Not long after she shared the provocative Bolsonaro clip, I had asked Elena what her motivations had been. Quote, I thought it was interesting. That's it, she had responded. In a sense, Elena was using Facebook to work through her thoughts about Bolsonaro, including her discomfort with his proposal to make gun ownership easier for ordinary citizens, and about Lula, who for Elena had been a great president despite the allegations of corruption contributing to her empty expectations of politics and the state. For Elena, Facebook is both strange and volatile because it isn't limited to face-to-face friends. Such a public elicits incongruous stances from Elena towards her grandson, one protective, the other critical and chiding. Elena wants not to see her family discussing politics, but on Facebook, family becomes what I conceptualize as a strange public in which usual principles of privacy, solidarity, and non-confrontation, and we could add to that list hierarchy, are troubled. By asking Hamilton to exit a conversation that, quote, has nothing to do with him, Everton also makes overtures towards a notion of family that is untenable on Facebook. Different from his grandmother, however, Everton uses Facebook as a platform on which to cultivate his own political voice. Although the effort turns cynical to the extent that he feels his main interlocutor, Hamilton, and even his grandmother, is attempting to shut him down, which he understands in explicitly generational terms. His overt mention of homophobia in the stream of comments is an experiment of sorts, a provisional assertion prioritizing a particular form of injustice to which he might have a personal connection. The lukewarm response Everton gets from his grandmother, the heavy frequency of like emojis from his uncle Gabriel that his uncle posts on Hamilton's posts, and the absence of participation from his parents or his brother, whether through texts or emojis, heighten his feelings of alienation. Increasingly, virtual space would come into conflict with the experience of family in face-to-face interactions during the election. The last ethnographic moment. This is from October 3rd, 2018. Elena invites me over for afternoon coffee and snacks. And when I stop by on the way home from teaching, I see she's dressed up and has bought fresh rolls and cheese. I'm aware, as Elena knows, that familial frustrations and arguments linked to the elections have been intensifying. Gabriel, Elena's oldest son, has lately stepped up, using his own Facebook page and the family's private WhatsApp group to praise his candidate and to argue the need to demolish the entire political establishment in Brazil. If asked about his support for Bolsonaro, Gabriel would likely mention at least one of the following themes: the need for a president who, quote, owes nothing to anybody, unquote, and would thus be singularly capable of bulldozing an irredeemably corrupt political system based on bribes. 2, the problem of violence in public urban spaces and the promising solution of making gun ownership easier for the citizenry. 3, the critique of human rights discourses which, for Gabriel and for Bolsonaro, exacerbate violence by giving undue respect and legal protection to undeserving criminals. 4, the urgent need to reintroduce discipline, respect, and morality through a structured vision of education. And finally, the need to keep the PT from ever assuming power again in Brazil. Particularly uncomfortable with Gabriel's support for Bolsonaro is his nephew, whom we've already met, Everton, Elena's grandson, Everton. Everton is gay, though at the time of the elections, he was not out to his family. In private, however, the family regularly speculated about the sexuality of this beloved grandson. Gabriel, who at the time of the elections had no children of his own, was particularly anxious about the sexuality of his nephew, an anxiety that resonated with his concerns about the breakdown of morality and respect in Brazilian society and his ever-intensifying conviction that the lion's share of blame for this lay with Lula and the PT. By mid-2018, Everton was several months into his first ever relationship with a classmate from his program at the university. And he felt a growing sense of disconnect between his out life, his vida assumida on campus, and the secrecy at home. I myself identify as gay, and by the elections, most of the family was aware of this, and perhaps offset by my status as an Americano with academic credentials, seemed to have little issue. Nonetheless, background tension grew as Everton became increasingly frustrated with his uncle's postings on Facebook and WhatsApp about the moral menace of homosexuality. For his part, Gabriel grappled with the growing disconnect between the long-standing affection between him and his nephew and their intensifying discord online. A disconnect that Gabriel perhaps linked to my own friendship with the family. There was some basis for this, as I enjoyed a strong friendship with his mother, with his wife, and with his nephew, whom I have always tried to support as he moves forward in constructing a new sexual subjectivity. On this particular day, the coffee and snacks setup is much fancier than I'm accustomed to, and I have the sense that Elena is trying to perform some sense of normalcy. And indeed, as we start catching up, she focuses on conspicuously non-political themes, such as her infant granddaughter. She has new photos to show me, and a massive cake she is planning to bake for a party at the Military Officers Club her son Gabriel manages. The vibe is disrupted, however, soon after Everton comes down from his family household and joins the conversation. While he's telling us about a new desk his father, Edmilson, got him, the TV news playing in the background turns to Bolsonaro, at which point Elena suddenly turns down the volume and blurts out, quote, "My God, I can't take it anymore. Bolsonaro here, Bolsonaro there. But it doesn't change, does it, Everton? Today, the whole family discussed Bolsonaro in the WhatsApp group. Everyone has a point of view on Bozo, right? But dear God, my dear God, for God's sake, this week I went to sleep and woke up at 1:30 in the morning, almost 2 o'clock, and they were still in the group debating," unquote. It comes as little surprise to learn that the recent arguments have pitted Everton and his cousin Andrea, the one who had cut her hair short, against their uncle Gabriel. This in turn has frustrated Everton's mom, Luzimar, with her son. He playfully says, she hates me these days. Elena brings up the Facebook fiasco involving Hamilton. She says, quote, his politics are sick, unquote, Hamilton's, but now accuses her grandson of having been too confrontational. And here's the conversation. I'm going to read it quickly. Elena, Hamilton wasn't being mean. Everton, yes, he was. Come on. He was bashing me there. He said I was immature. Elena, but isn't that right? Everton, but why am I immature to you? Elena, you're a teenager. You only got interested recently. You have no knowledge of politics. You don't know anything. Everton, why don't I know? Elena, how are you going to debate something? Do you see me debating? I don't debate. Why? Because I don't understand politics. Everton, but you're not a teenager. You're full of experience. Why don't you debate? Elena, because one has things, opinions that for us are private. Everton, just like I have opinions that are mine. Elena, listen, that's exactly why you're immature. You won't even vote, but you have to confront people, which is a lack of respect. Everton, you expect me to be a mature teenager, but you don't expect maturity from a person who's more than 40 years old, like Uncle Gabriel. Elena, Elena, that's his problem. Everton, it's my problem too. I'm winding down. There's a delicate moment when Everton implies that Elena allowed Gabriel to take over her thinking on the elections. She responds defensively, but with a provocation of her own. No, he didn't convince me, she says. If he had, I'd vote for Bolsonaro. I don't accept it. You can be a homosexual, you can be a thief, you can be a married man, you can be whatever, but you have to have dignity, respect for others, unquote. That Elena begins her statement with an affirmation of the rights of homosexuals is powerful for the awareness and acceptance it implies of her grandson's homosexuality, which she's never discussed with him openly. And yet soon after, she starts complaining about the gender ideology promoted by the PT and proceeds to show me on her cell phone a video of a gay hunky Jesus contest, that's what it's called, consisting of several scantily clad male contestants on a stage competing in a highly sexualized manner under the campy judgment of drag queens. Gabriel himself posts this video a few days later with the caption in all caps, Bolsonaro will put an end to this. Before long, Everton is rolling his eyes and says, I have to leave, I have to study, and excuses himself. The exchange recounted that I've just told you about started off playfully enough, but Everton ended up challenging his grandmother at every turn in a manner I had never seen before. And Elena became palpably frustrated. She became especially upset at her grandson's challenge to her statement that she doesn't understand politics, to which she responded with an assertion that political opinions are best kept private. To Elena, Everton's attempts to debate on Facebook, in the family's WhatsApp group, in our conversation, violated a sense of respect, rooted alternately in obeying elders and not pushing people to discuss private matters. For his part, Everton was confounded that his grandmother, who has rich life experience, indeed, she is the only member of the family who has living memory of the dictatorship period, doesn't join family discussions of matters he feels to be of personal and national importance. He was also, I think, vexed and somewhat hurt that Elena didn't support his attempts to cultivate an adult political consciousness and hadn't defended him when he was attacked by Hamilton in a public forum. Just a few concluding remarks, and then I'm done. The day after the elections, Elena shares on Facebook her responses to a series of questions about her essential characteristics as a person. The question was, quote, what 7 things are totally true about you, unquote. The answer that Elena posts about herself, she has a lot of faith in God, her soul is enlightened, she loves to travel, she protects those she loves, she doesn't give up easily, she does everything for her family, and she does good without self-interest, unquote. That same day, she sends me the following note on WhatsApp. I'm so happy. I'm so tired of my family bickering, but now things can get back to normal. For me, family is everything. Politics doesn't interest me, unquote. And indeed, in posts like the one above, she seems to be reasserting the social, harmonious view of family she had felt to be slipping away these past few months. Gabriel, meanwhile, divides his still frequent Facebook posting between expressions of excitement and hope for the return of order and respect to Brazil with the election of Bolsonaro, frustration at Brazilians, including his nephew and niece, who have modified their Facebook profile to integrate the anti-Bolsonaro slogan, "I will be the resistance," and declarations of pride and love for his wife. Gabriel's wife, Patricia, meanwhile, is on Facebook very little, but does reshare a short text about what led Lucifer to be expelled from heaven. Rather than behaviors such as prostitution, homosexuality, or drug use, it was his pride in thinking he was right to judge others. A thinly veiled condemnation of precisely the Bolsonaro campaign rhetoric that her husband has been posting. Late in the day, on October 28th, Everton texts me with these words: "These elections have forever changed my perception of people close to me." In the age of social media, the Pereiras, like all Brazilians, struggle to reconcile divergences between virtual and face-to-face interactions. During the months leading up to the 2018 elections, these divergences intensified and prompted various anxieties about the status of family within the household and in Brazilian society. For Helena, the family under threat is a harmonious, hierarchical social unit in which children, even adult children, do not question their elders and do not discuss private matters with outsiders. For Gabriel, the notion of family crystallizes a patriarchal vision of order and respect founded on a man's ability to provide for his kin, a normative masculinity that was undermined during the PT years. Whereas, however, Helena and Gabriel, each in their own way, seek to restore a family understood to be under threat, the 2018 elections have led Everton to deep ambivalence regarding his interactions with and obligations to kin. Unlike his uncle and grandmother, for whom family is the solution, for Everton, family has become irrevocably a problem. For all the Pereiras, the possibility of a shared vision of family has been contaminated by the blurring of lines between public and private experience and between social and political communication brought on by online social media. In the anxious, interactive flux of election season disputes, family for the Pereiras has become what I have referred to as a strange public. It is perhaps fitting to end my presentation with news that Dona Helena gleefully conveyed to me via WhatsApp months after the elections. Quote, "Gabriel is going to be a father. It's a girl," unquote. After expressing my congratulations, I asked Helena how far along Patricia was in the pregnancy. Doing the math, it was easy enough for me to work out that this child had been conceived in early October 2018. A moment of extreme familial tension among the Pereiras and more or less incessant Facebook postings by Gabriel about the breakdown of family values in Brazil. The newest addition to a family whose members diverge so profoundly about what constitutes a good family in a historical moment characterized by economic precarity and political polarizations, Patricia and Gabriel's infant daughter faces a profoundly uncertain future. Thank you very much, and I'm excited to talk with you and take your questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Young. So if anyone has any questions or comments, feel free to either unmute yourself and raise your hand or use the chat. Just kind of an open discussion. So thanks so much, Dr. Young.
Of course. And also, it doesn't have to be questions. If those of you who work in Brazil have been there, I'm curious if this resonates with your own impressions or your own experiences.
So there was a comment from Marina. They say, thank you, Professor. I love the Precarious novela that's 20. It reminds me of my own family. How old are the uncles, Gabriel and Nison? So interesting to think that the dictatorship was also a reaction to teenager rebellion against moral values in the 60s.
Yeah, this is something we're all talking a lot about. You know, is this a cyclical phenomenon that just happens every generation in some way? You know, people are, you know, resistant about change, and, you know, people of Elena's generation can't communicate much with people of Everton's generation. So that's one reading. A very different reading is that, no, this is totally different. Brazil's had a functional democracy for, you know, the last 3 decades. Hard fought, hard won, consolidated in the 1990s. And now we have a president in Brazil who openly and without irony questions whether democracy is actually a better system of government than dictatorship. When Bolsonaro is nostalgic for the dictatorship, it's not metaphorical, it's not figurative, it's literal. He actually thinks life was better then. So some have argued, and I'm inclined to agree, that this is different from the standard generational differences. I like calling it the Pereira novela das Vinci is spot on for sure. And it is kind of like a novella. The only thing that's missing is for someone to, you know, declare that they're the illegitimate son of Bolsonaro. That would make it a perfect novella. But anyway, the question about how are Gabriel and Edmilson, oh, how old are they? Gabriel, who I'm writing a chapter of my book about, which is very challenging for me because I want to keep my friendship with this family. I have all of the you know, institutional review board consent forms signed, and I have the blessing of Dona Elena, but I'm still, they know I'm writing this book and I'm changing all the names, but I'm still nervous about my friendship with the family. Gabriel is probably, I think he must be about 41 or 42 at this point. And as I said, he was the last of Elena's children to have children of his own. Edmilson is probably 37 or 38. Yeah, thereabouts. And there are actually 2 other children that I didn't talk about much, two daughters as well. And each one of them has their own story. One of them is the only evangelical neo-Pentecostal in the family, and that's a whole different set of issues as well. It's why I love this family, is because they kind of have everything. There's a Bolsonaro supporter in the military, there's an evangelical who has difficult time getting along with the rest of the family, and there's a gay grandson. It's kind of, it's all there, you know?
Thank you, Marina. I don't know if you, I saw that you had turned your camera on, so I don't know if you wanted to make any other comments, but.
I'm also curious if, you know, if any of you, I mean, one thing I like to think about, I didn't talk at all about it, is, you know, is this kind of like the same story of what progressives have experienced in the United States in the last 5 years? And there is, in, you know, in Brazilian studies, there is an argument, you know, that we might even call Trump, call Bolsonaro the Trump of the tropics. And there are some similarities. It's not a coincidence that there are some similarities. Trump is Bolsonaro's hero. He's his he refers to him as his mentor, although that implies that Trump actually has some sense of that, which I'm not sure about. But I tend to actually lean against the Trump of the tropics narrative. I think there's so much about Bolsonaro that's very Brazilian and distinctively Brazilian. You know, Bolsonaro is a career politician, which Trump was the opposite of, a career politician who had been a military man before that. Also, Trump has no military experience. So, and they're, even rhetorically, they're very different kinds of guys. We can talk about this or not talk about it, but I would say that Bolsonaro's, his MO is to just be totally uncensored and kind of play the sort of what I refer to in my paper as the brincalhão, as the clown kind of, and you know, Trump, although he embraces uncensored speech, he's not trying to be a clown. He's doing something different. His discourse, his discursive style, his way of speaking is not like Bolsonaro's. So I don't know. I think it's, you can only push that too far. But I don't know if any of you have any thoughts, or if you want to, you know, if you agree, or if you want to challenge me on that, I'd welcome it. I'm always thinking about that question. Or any other questions, of course, about the family or about the work or what's going on. If you find yourselves interested in this, I encourage you to, you can check out this book I was shamelessly promoting. If you, whoa, sorry, there it is. If you can't afford $27 to buy it, email me and I'll send you the PDF of my chapter, and you can read the sort of long version of that. The chapter that I have in this book is sort of the blueprint for the book I'm writing here while I'm here in Santa Fe. Let's see, there's a question here. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, you know, anyone who is from Latin America has a WhatsApp account and probably has a WhatsApp group that they share with their family. That's very different. The same cannot be said of the typical family in the United States, unless they're Latinx. Then they have WhatsApp and have a family WhatsApp group. But we don't typically have that. Sometimes we do. You know, sometimes there might be a Facebook Instant Messenger group, but it's virtually universal in Latin America. And I think that in the case of Brazil, that has incredible implications, I think, that every family has its own private kind of sacred space that until a few years ago was not for talking about politics. It was for talking about someone got baptized, someone got married, someone got into college, there's a party happening, there's a birthday, there's a meal, Elena made a cake, you know, but now it's, and this has happened all over the continent, not just Brazil, because a lot of, you know, these political tensions are happening in other countries. So anyway, you know, this has happened across the continent, and I think that WhatsApp, the family WhatsApp group, has actually given the Latin American experience something very distinctive that's different from what is typical in the United States, because we don't have that same WhatsApp group as a kind of historically very private forum that's become contaminated with this. And I call it a strange public. It's become, since you've got people like Hamilton invading the you know, Facebook comments of the grandmother, and I still to this day I don't even know who he really is. And Elena, when I asked her, couldn't remember ever actually meeting him, but she's seen him on Facebook, so she refers to him as her friend. So yeah. All right. Yes, Marina. I would love to talk about unfeminine women. In all seriousness, gender is so central to this whole story. Yeah. So it is a bit complicated. So, all right, so I'll work my way to unfeminine women. You mentioned Gilma. For those of you and the rest of you who watch this talk virtually, you know, later on, you know, if you're familiar with Brazilian politics from the last 10 years, you know that Dilma Rousseff, the PT president who followed Lula, does not conform to any conventional norms or ideals of femininity. She has a deep voice. She's a little heavyset. She's not apologetic in her speech. She doesn't qualify her statements in a way associated with conventionally feminine speech. And she's not charming in the way that everyone, even those who hate it and hate Lula, acknowledge he is. He's a charming, charismatic dude, and she never was that and never tried to be that. So there's no question that she was a conventionally unfeminine president. And that was part of the discomfort with her. Unfortunately, it's much more complicated than that. I wish it could just be explained as, sexism. That's, I would say, part of why the last decade has been so tough, such a tough nut to crack, because it's so many things coming together. It is patriarchy reasserting itself, sexism, homophobia, racism. It's the old affluent middle class feeling its status in society was coming under threat, kind of fed up with all of these poverty reduction initiatives that the PT successfully undertook. It's that. It's also macroeconomic factors, reduced Chinese demand for Brazilian exports that really crippled the Brazilian economy. It's all of these things coming together that, the way I think of it, they don't explain in a linear way Bolsonaro's election. It's not that simple. I think that that's a misguided effort to try and explain what was the key factor that explains Bolsonaro's election. It was a confluence of conditions, of possibility that came together. But anyway, and gender, and specifically sexism, is very much a part of that. But I just wanted to, without going too far off on this, I just want to mention, I mentioned this, I alluded in my talk a couple of times to gender ideology, or ideologia de género, which is well, I don't know if this will offend anyone in the office, but it's kind of like critical race theory. It's an ideological construct, mostly by people who don't know what they're talking about, frankly. And in the Brazilian case, gender ideology is a fantasy of what happened to education under the PT, and that it basically encouraged youth to be gay, essentially, through pedagogical policy. There's a much longer version to that story, and I'm oversimplifying a little bit, but that fantasy that leftist governments are going to morally corrupt the youth of Brazil is a recurrent theme. And it's not just about sexism, it's also about sexuality and, and I guess I'm sorry to say that there's a real parallel between that and the kind of transphobia that is unfolding right now here in the United States. So gender ideology is big in one chapter of my book. So I'm thinking a lot about that, and I'd be very happy to dialogue later, in the future with any of you who are thinking about that as well. These are great questions, by the way. I appreciate them. Anything else? Go for it.
Wonderful. Thank you very much for your talk. This is going to be a bit of a off-the-cuff question, but I thought I'd ask it after your comments on gender ideology. But you spoke about these different constructions of corruption in one of the ethnographic episodes that range from political corruption with the events of the past decade with Operation Lava Jato, but it also has a much more expansive meaning as a sort of broadly sense of moral corruption or degeneration. And I was wondering, like, how those constructions of corruption are linked to nostalgia, and sort of nostalgia about the military regime, or the ascendancy of the new middle class during Lula's first 2 terms. Is there a link there, or isn't there?
Yeah, no, there is. It's a great question, and I'm thinking a lot about this today. I mean, these days. So I'm honestly, I just, in the chapter that I've been working on that focuses exclusively on the military regime, the democratic military regime YouTube clip. It's all about that whole story. I finally, realized I finally did an extensive literature review on nostalgia, kind of, that would be relevant to this. So it's still very much on the front burner of my mind. So what I have learned in my review and my thinking and writing about nostalgia in the last couple of months is that most people like me, maybe like you, I don't know, like social scientists and historians who study politics in some broad sense, most of us, we think nostalgia is bad. It's bad for democracy. It leans a society towards populism and the far right, and a lot of people who have written about the nostalgia, the kind of nostalgia that I've shared today, like Gabriel's nostalgia and his younger brother Edgy Milson's nostalgia and Elena's nostalgia, would write it off as they're just, it's false consciousness. They're clueless, they're ignorant, and they've been duped by the media into thinking that somehow life was better then, or maybe that the Brazilian state has failed to stimulate a dialogue at the level of society on like what the meaning of the dictatorship was. So anyway, my first point is that we tend to think nostalgia is bad for democracy. I'm trying to push against that a little bit, because anthropologically it's too easy. And I don't like false consciousness arguments. I don't want to just say, well, Elena and her oldest son, Gabriel, they're just kind of misguided, I don't want to fall into that trap. That's not satisfying to me, because even Gabriel, who when I tell people about him, they go, oh, what a hateful character. He's not. He's a sweetheart. He loves his family. He loves his gay nephew, and he even loved Lula. I didn't talk about it. So part of his anger at the PT is that he feels betrayed by Lula, but he still would say Lula was the best president Brazil ever had. He just was corrupt, so we got to get rid of the PT forever. So my point here is that the kind of nostalgia that Gabriel has, which seems sort of extreme, is actually very complicated, and he's carrying a lot of different kinds of sentiment or affect simultaneously. And that, I don't want to just reduce that analytically to false consciousness or ignorance, or he's just sort of lost to the far right. To me, that's not satisfying. There is a connection. By the way, if this is something you're interested in, please get in touch with me and I'd be happy to talk to you about it more, because I'm still learning about nostalgia. So there is, in much of the literature on nostalgia and in my own work, there is frequently a connection between nostalgia, a longing, a melancholic longing for an imagined past when life was supposedly better. There's a common connection between that and moral degradation in the present moment. It's something we've seen all over the world, including in former socialist, like Eastern European countries. It's a very common pattern. And it's also, frankly, it's part of like Make America Great Again. There's that's a form of nostalgia that implies, that hinges upon the idea that social relations were clearer and better in those days, whenever those days were. I'm aware of like the clock, so I could talk about this for an hour, but I don't want to do that. So thank you for the question, and please get in touch with me if you'd like to. It looks like there might be one more?
Yeah, I think there's one more from Bryce. Yeah.
Do I have time to answer it? Is
Yeah,
that okay?
yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Bryce, let's see. Yes, okay. That's a tall order for me to be short, but I'm going to try to do it. Okay, here we go. Yeah, other ideas about social media. Is your idea of strange public engaging in a wider discourse on social media and family? So I'm glad you picked up on strange public. It's in some ways it's the most sort of experimental and maybe ambitious part of my paper today, and because I'm trying to make a new concept that I hope other people will. They don't have to cite me. I just mean I hope it'll be useful. It's my attempt to capture what's. I mean, it's a little bit unusual to think of a family as a public. You could say, no, a family is anything but. It's more of a private. But it is, in a sense, it is a public. It's a guarded public for the members of the extended family. And my argument, and I think you pick this up, you got this, is that social media, specifically WhatsApp and Facebook, have troubled the status of family as a guarded public and made it a strange public. It's experienced as strange. I mean, you could use queer theory to talk about this and say it has become a queer public, not in the sexual sense, but in the troubled, problematized sense, for all, for Elena and for her grandson. So is this engaging a wider discourse on social media and family? I'll just give a very quick response to that and say, yes, I'm definitely as you guessed, I'm working on this in the book. I'm trying to, but it's easy to find examples of this from all over the place. If any of you are familiar with the anthropologist Giuliano Spyer, Spyer, he did an incredible book on Facebook in Brazil, and he gets deep into this. His advisor from, oh goodness, is it the College of London or LSE? I can't remember. But anyway, Daniel Miller is sort of the world's leading anthropologist who's working on Facebook and what it's doing to social relations. So I'm very engaged with that work and that kind of line of work. Yeah, anyway, maybe that's enough said for now. Let me just, by the way, I'm going to type my email into the chat box, and please don't be shy. If you want to dialogue with me, it'd be a pleasure. I welcome that sort of thing. It doesn't bother me a bit. I'm here in Santa Fe for another 2.5 months also, for what it's worth.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Young, for the wonderful presentation. And thank you everyone for your insightful questions and just to continue the conversation. So we really appreciate everyone this afternoon and hope you guys all have a great evening.
Great, my pleasure. Thanks everyone. Thank you, Marlene.